Hello everybody, we are working on Chapter 5 tonight, and you can see the topic for the evening is working with a technology called ActiveRecord. It's an integral part of working with Ruby on Rails, and basically what ActiveRecord allows us to do is to interface with various types of databases using what we call an abstraction layer, where we can use a different type of syntax basically to reach information that's stored both in our database and information that's instantiated as objects within our applications built upon the model or the M part of the MVC. So I'm going to give you kind of a little combination of lecture and demo here, as is pretty normal. I kind of trust that you guys will take the time to actually read through the chapter and read through it carefully. And I really caution you that if you guys are working on this stuff on your own and you're following the book, be really careful about reading everything. Okay, we're getting to the point in the book now where we're in Chapter 5, and this is where I think it starts to become challenging, because we're working with a different type of technology, and it's all about the nuance and the detail. And you'll find yourself, when you're working, if you miss a step, that often the only way to fix it is to step back pretty far to fix it. So one thing you're going to start hearing from me tonight is I'm going to be hammering the concept of versioning your work. And one of the first things we do before we code, in fact the first time we'll see in the instructions, that's the first thing I'm going to do is take my completed work so far and make sure that I have basically a snapshot, a saved version of it that I can revert to if necessary. And whenever you complete any significant steps in this class, or whenever you're working on stuff and then you need to step away, you should be creating another snapshot or another version that you can keep, especially if it's working. If for some reason you guys have not finished your work from Chapter 4, you are going to find yourself at a little bit of a disadvantage going into this chapter, perhaps, because we are building on the same application. So one option that you have is to actually go to our course shell or the author's website, and I'm trying to see if I have a browser open here, and I do not. But in the course shell, I have all the data files for this book. Yes, the completed assignments, basically, but they are built on an older version of the textbook.
It says in the book to carry on.
Now, what somebody is indicating to me here in class, and I had paused the video to make sure I answered the question correctly, was the fact that in Chapter 4, we really didn't do anything to build upon that blog application that we did in Chapter 3, because we were just playing with the Ruby prompt, basically, and learning a couple little syntax things. So we will be versioning the Chapter 3 work. But what I'm trying to point out here is if you go to your course shell, and I, at some point, boy, that's being very slow, put on the resources page, I believe, a link to the resources for the book, and somewhere here, and I'm not seeing it real quickly, maybe you guys can, right here, download source code. If you click this button here, you'll pull down a zip file that contains all the code for all the chapters of the book, hypothetically working. Keeping in mind, it was developed using a different version of Ruby and a different version of Rails. So when you do pull these up, so for example, if you're going to start working on Chapter 5 tonight, and you pull up the Chapter 3 source code, because that's the one that we would pull up from the book that's complete, you can use that as a basis for working on Chapter 5, but there will be a few steps you might have to do. Most notably, run a bundle install, because that will update all the components to whatever the version of your product. So that's a little nuance. But so if you ever get in that position where things aren't working right, or you need to go back and you didn't save a version, you always have the book as a safety net. Or if you want, you can always contact me, and I'm happy to share code as well. Now, some of you might look at that as like, well, that's kind of cheating. I could just go into the book and just turn in what's in the book and be done, right? It doesn't really quite work that easily. If it did, it would make your life painfully simple, and you wouldn't learn a darn thing. But the beauty of this is that, or not, depending on your perspective, is that it's challenging. So, but there's really significant reward in working through stuff that's challenging, especially when you get it accomplished. You really feel a sense of accomplishment. You have a much deeper understanding about things. So please keep in mind that you can do that. The other thing I want to remind you is if you are challenged with your equipment in any way, shape, or form, or your equipment's not working right, our VDI, and all of you have accounts. Anybody who's registered for these classes, I pre-set up accounts at the beginning of the semester. The VDI does have full installation of Ruby on Rails. It is probably last year's version, but it is working, so you can always go to the VDI and do your work. The only thing is that files don't persist natively in the VDI, but if you go into the file folder of the VDI, there is a network drive attached to your account that will actually persist, but I'm not always comfortable with that, so I usually push things up to Google Drive. So just keep those things in mind as you're working. All right, let's jump back over to the book and start plowing through the material. Now, some of the concepts here are going to be perhaps new to some of you. The assumption, of course, is that all of you have had advanced databases at this point, and that you've probably had PHP, maybe the regular PHP class and the advanced PHP class where you were exposed to MySQL databases. And then you've probably taken Java classes where you've interfaced with databases, and you may have an intro to programming if you're also in the software program. So there's a number of different spots where you should have learned about databases and the concepts of databases. If you have not, I would implore you to do some independent reading on databases, just so you understand what they do and how they operate. The technology that we're working with, called the ActiveRecord, as I mentioned, is what some people will refer to as an abstraction layer. And what that basically means is that we can interface with our database without having to write SQL commands. So we will build models, the M of the MVC, based upon database constructs. Those models will become instantiated, and then what happens is as they become instantiated as objects, we have this component called Object Relational Mapping, ORM, and somewhere in the readings here you'll probably see that. And what that means is once we've instantiated, we can then use dot syntax. So think of it like this, is like when you're working with like an object in like Java, right? You have the class, maybe the superclass, the subclass, the method, and then maybe the data field. And you can basically, by using a dot syntax, so if you guys remember some of your Java homework, you might have like horse, dot racehorse, dot speed, or something like that. And what that really does is we have these objects that are instantiated, and by using that syntax, we can tunnel down through the objects and get to the components that we need. And the object relational mapping basically does the same thing for database components. So that's really what we're going to be working with here predominantly. Now, you'll notice here in the book, the author is kind of pointing out that if you want, you can go, well, he's got a link right to it. You can go right to the Chapter 3 zip file in the archive and download that source code as a starting point if you need to. If you successfully completed Chapter 3, you do not need to. You're all set to go. And what I'll have you do, in fact, why don't we do it right now just to get that part out of the way. Let's version our work right now. Now, if you were working as a coding professional, most coding professionals would choose a technology either like GitHub or Bitbucket or a few other tools, but those are the two main ones that developers use that automatically version the work. But there's a series of command line commands that actually take a little bit of time to learn, and really what they do is about what I'm about to do manually. So I want to show you, basically demonstrating here. I'm going to go to my C drive. I am going to find my projects folder, and the blog application is what we built in Chapter 3. I know mine's working, and it's just fine. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to give it a right click. I'm going to do a copy. I'm going to do a paste. And then I'm just going to rename it. And I'm just going to call it Chapter 3 Complete, or Working, or something like that. Some people will put dates on them, whatever it is. But now what I'm going to do is now I have a copy of it that I know works. It's just sitting right there. So if I screw up, I can go back to that one and pick back up again. Now this one, the one that's just named blog, that's the one I'm going to keep working on. And then when I reach significant milestones in the work, or if we take a break, or if maybe I pause the video, I'll probably save my work and then make another copy and say chapter 5 up to page 75 complete. And that way, if I need to redo the chapter, I don't have to go all the way back to the beginning each time. Now the reason I say this is because I know that these database chapters, chapter 5 and chapter 6 that deal with ActiveRecord, can be time consuming. And the way that I know that is I just look back in the course shell at Unit 4, and then I look at the number of videos that are recorded that go along with those chapters from the previous 2 years. Now I'm recording a fresh set of videos, but the old ones are out there. If you guys want to work ahead, you can follow those. But you can see the amount of time that was put in class to work through those. So this is also a tip that we're going to be on these chapters probably for a few weeks. So if we get to the point where the due dates are getting close and we're not quite through the chapters, I will adjust those due dates. So I just want you to be aware of that. And if you look at the due dates right now, for example, chapter 5 is set for next week Wednesday, assuming that we're going to work on it tonight. We got next Wednesday to work on it too, and hopefully by the end of that night you guys will have it complete. And if not, I will move that due date out. And I've done this a few times, so I have kind of like a little bit of a track record I can look back on. So it's not without some basis. All right. So the fresh videos will be posted. Well, I don't know if I'll post them tonight, but probably tomorrow sometime, and I'll put out an announcement when that happens. All right. Without further ado, let's get back over to our project folder. I did make copies here. And let's move on. All right, so here's the topic that I was just talking about, object relational mapping. The acronym is ORM, so if you ever see that one floating around, now you got another one to add to your repertoire. There isn't necessarily always a good way to do this type of thing in a lot of different languages. The one thing that you will see as a consistent syntax is that programming languages that will leverage ORM within their coding structure will tend to use that dot syntax, but that's not always necessarily a rule. So be mindful of that. But this technique can work in other languages as well. Take a look at some of the syntax here, and I do have highlights here and there, and sometimes I actually read them like I'm trying to do right now. But I want you to take a look at the syntax of a class and notice that there's that weird little less than sign in there, and then there's 2 colons and it says base. Now for those of you that have done programming in other languages and understand that what a subclass and a superclass is, right, or a parent class and a child class, or inheritance, or polymorphism. You've heard these terms in other programming languages. So that little less than sign is the equivalent of saying in Java, my application extends application. So it's a way of saying extends. It's a way of saying that the class that I'm creating called book is extending the parent class ActiveRecord, which is the one that allows us to do all the mapping of these these technologies. All right. So let's take a look at some of the first examples here. All right. So the very first one. Now, and I'm going to just tell you very quickly, I don't think that's where we're typing our first commands, okay? It's not for a little bit yet that we're typing commands, so this is not stuff you need to type in. Oh, well, you could, I suppose. But notice the syntax here. These are Ruby commands. So these are things that we would either put into our code or run at a prompt. The first one that we would type in is lowercase book equals uppercase book dot new. Now, keeping in mind that we have a class up here. Notice the class has an uppercase B. And what is it extending? It's extending ActiveRecord. So really what we're creating is that blueprint for an object. Now, by saying that I'm creating book new, it's the same as saying I'm instantiating a version of this class, and I'm storing it in book with a lowercase b. All right? That's the syntax. When you follow through, you can see that the next couple of lines will start using the dot syntax. And if you remember back to what we were doing with the blog, how the blog had like a title, a body, a publish date. Remember that stuff? Right? So in this example, they're not following that syntax. They're using things that would be attributed to a book. So what does a book have? A book has a title, has a publisher, and a publish date. So what they're doing here, notice, is they're adding to the object book the fact that it has a property called title. You could think of that as a data field, but really in this situation, it would be part of a tie-in to our model, which ties to the database table. And what we're doing is we're saying book.title, and there's your string of text, the publisher, and then the published at date. And then we store that in the variable temporarily in memory, but it does not write back to the model or the database until we do a book.save. So I want you to think about that whole process. The very first step, the one that I have highlighted, that instantiates. Not only instantiates the object, but stores it in a variable for further manipulation. Then we go through one at a time and apply properties or values to each of the properties, or data fields, however you want to think of it, or columns. One row of a database table, that's the way to think of it. And then I issue the command save. And if you think about how a database works, and you guys should know this, when you worked in SQL Server, or if you work in MySQL, you can be working on one row of a database table. You type in information, move to the next one, next one, next one. And while you're in that field, that hasn't written until you're done with that record. And the moment you leave that record, it writes to the database. And that's exactly the process here. The difference is it's done manually, it's done through code, and it's done through the syntax. And really, this syntax is beautifully simple. It's not a very complicated syntax, and in some ways, it's pretty flexible. All right. We have already talked about the product SQLite through some of the earlier weeks. We already have that installed. The other thing that I also recommended to you guys, if you remember, is that you also install this tool here, the SQLite browser, and that's actually a good tool to launch. Because one thing that's very helpful is when you're working with a database is being able to look at the database contents and not always trust what you see at the prompt. For me, it's easier, and I think it's such a nice free tool that we should use it. All right. Now, those of you that have formally studied databases, which should be all of you, because this is a fourth semester class and advanced databases is a second semester class, you should be familiar with what SQL or SQL is, and you know how people pronounce that always depends on what school you're coming from. But I think it's perfectly acceptable to say SQL or SQL, and they're both pretty valid. Notice that I got a highlight there, and notice what the highlight says. It says the problem with SQL is it's not object-oriented. It is a query language. It's not a programming language. So therefore, there are no objects. You can create procedures, you can create logic, you can create data types, sort of, but it is not a programming language. It is a query language. It's a different type of thing. So what we're really doing here, and this is where I hope you gain a little bit of appreciation, is the fact that we are going to be taking stuff that's in a database, attaching to a model that we've created inside of our code, which then allows that database table or content to be instantiated as an object for manipulation in the program. Because here's the issue. The data in the database, because the databases are run by SQL, is not object-oriented, we have to pull the data from the database, turn it into an object, do our manipulations, and then save it back. That's the procedure. All right. So if you haven't caught on to this yet, we're learning a lot about not just Ruby on Rails and now ActiveRecord. We are learning about this MVC architecture, the Model View Controller. And when we're working with ActiveRecord, the focus is very heavily on the model. The model, and this is important, does not necessarily mean that you're working directly with the database. You can be working with a model and it does not affect the database. Sometimes you pull data out, you manipulate it, or you just look at it and use it maybe to display a screen. But sometimes you do manipulate the data, and sometimes you write it back, and sometimes you don't. But the model is necessary as a code structure in order to be able to have that connection to the database and to be able to do all that abstraction. All right, so going back to this concept of models, notice that highlight that I have at the top of the page there. It says ActiveRecord lets you model real-world things in your code. So that's the way you should think of it, because database entries usually are based upon information of some sort of an entity, right? It says a model might be named person, product, or article. And notice the model has the capital letter. So that is a pretty important little concept. And because we can apply this abstraction layer, we can skip the whole process of writing SQL statements to do queries. Right? Queries to retrieve information or to store information. That's a really cool thing. All right. Now notice as we move down the page here, it says ActiveRecord conventions. Notice the two highlights. The two main conventions you need to know about working with ActiveRecord. First thing is that class names are singular. So, and then table names are plural. So what that means is when we instantiate something as a model, we will refer to it in the singular. So for example, person, right? And then if we, and you're going to see a little example below, and then if I refer to it in the plural in terms of what goes into the table, we would, what's the plural of person? People, right? Yeah, that gets people all the time because it's not persons, although some people do use that as a plural, but that's not really formally correct English. And then the next thing is tables contain an identity column named ID. So in other words, by rule of this language, and this is really a good rule to follow, and you should have learned this in your database class, that even if you don't use the ID field of a table, every table should have an ID field, if only to keep track of the records. But that's a convention that we assume. All right, so take a look here at some of the conventions in terms of naming. So if I have a table in my database called events, notice lowercase e, the class that I would use to model the events table would be called event in the singular. Now, this isn't a rule. It's a convention, and I want you to be really important with that, but these are conventions that really are preferred by the language, so you're best off following it. Yeah, it is actually logical when you start to think about it, because if you have a table can hold multiple events. But when I'm querying a database, I might extract one single record, which is a singular thing, which is an event. Does that make sense? Okay. So, tables call people, the class would be person, categories would be category, order items would be order item. And then notice the weird conventions here too. When we're doing class names, they're preferring camel case or title case, and in the database they're preferring an underscore. All right, so that's kind of a little weird too. All right, next thing that we're going to work with here is another new command line tool. Yes, last week we learned the interactive Ruby prompt, and actually we were reintroduced to it. So that's one of the first things that we learned. But Rails, as a framework, also has its own console language and prompt. And one of the things that we're going to do right off the bat is we're going to launch the console. So if you haven't done so already, go to your Start menu, type CMD, and open up Command Prompt. And I'm going to narrow this up a little bit and just pull it off to the side. All right, so one of the first things we want to do here at the prompt, or at least what I recommend, is that we drop down to the root of C. So CD space backslash is a good way to do that. We may as well just jump into our projects folder. We may as well go to the blog. So CD projects, CD blog, and now that I'm at the prompt, I'm going to go ahead and type Rails console. Now, remember, this is a different prompt from the Ruby prompt. It's a different prompt from the regular C prompt. It is one that interfaces just with the Rails framework. So, make sure you get to that point. Now, isn't that interesting? Wait, it's a Ruby prompt. Yes, it's a Ruby prompt. But it is working through the Rails framework, and that's really kind of an important distinction there. All right, so once you have your prompt up and running, we are going to start to type in a series of commands here, and I'm going to split screen myself here so we can look at both things at the same time, and hopefully you'll be able to read those, and I'll try to keep both things on the screen at the same time if I can. Now, if you guys are remembering, in the application that we already built, I'm going to bring up the folder structure here in Windows, and I'm going to navigate into my project. I'm going to go into my app folder. I'm going to go to my models folder, and then I want you to kind of refresh your memory that we did some building in chapter 3 that allowed us to take the articles. Remember, like, we were able to see what articles we created and make new articles and delete them and edit them. Remember all that? And that was built upon basically this file called article RB. And I'm going to open that up with Notepad++. And we really didn't do much here, did we? But what we did do is we did put in validation that shows, that checked for the presence of having a title and a body, and otherwise it would throw an error. Okay, so we do already have a model. It's a primitive one. It doesn't really do very much yet. But I want you to understand basically that when I'm starting to type some of these next commands here, they work because we already have a model created. So, and that's an important thought. So the first command they'd like us to type, and you should follow along, is article with a capital A. So that should tell you that it refers to the model. And we're entering in a method called column names. What on earth do you suppose that does? Well, exactly what you would anticipate. It goes into our model, the model connects to the database, and then pulls back all the database column names. Now, for those of you wanting to play with this SQLite browser tool, I'm bringing that tool up on the screen. And if you're interested in downloading that, if you just very simply just Google the SQLite browser, you'll find that it's a free piece of software. We are going to connect to a database, so I'm going to click the Open Database button, and then I'm going to find my project folder, find my blog, find my database folder, and we're in development mode, so I'm choosing the development database, and I'm going to choose Open. All right. So when I open it, what it'll first show me is basically the schema or the structure of the database. And there are tables here that we didn't create. The one that we did create is the articles table. But notice how there's some other internal mechanisms that all databases have. And I can actually tunnel down here and expand articles and see all the different columns. So if I compare here, I got ID, title, body, published at, created, updated, excerpt, and location. And then if I go back to my prompt, I should see exactly that in that same order. So really what this method does is it connects the model to the database, goes to the schema here, and pulls back the information and reports it back to the prompt. So I can pull the information up from a prompt. I can pull the information up from my SQLite browser tool. If I'm curious about actually looking at the data, I can then come up here and click this Browse Data tab. And then from the drop-down here, choose the Articles table. And then it'll show me the content. And you know, the tool's pretty intuitive, but you see the same column names and the actual data that's inside. Notice also the ID numbers. Why do I not have a 1? Because whatever record number 1 was, I probably deleted it. That's why. Is that bad? No. Right? The other nice thing about having this tool at your disposal is that you can do things directly in the database. So if you had a piece of information in here that didn't end up quite how you wanted, or you wanted to delete a record, or you want to add a record, you can do that stuff directly from here, which is kind of nice. So this is why I like to use this tool kind of as an auxiliary tool. The book doesn't really push it. It's just a tool that I discovered with some of my students a number of years ago, and we really liked it, and we found it very helpful. All right, let's move on to the next command. The next command is just article. Article being the model. So if I just type that in, notice what the model pulls back. It pulls back the name of the instantiated data, and then in comma separated pairs, the name of the column and the type of information that it holds. So the data type of the information. Right? So the ID field, for example, is an integer. The title is a string. The body is text. There's some date times, some more strings. So same type of thing. It's giving you all the column names, but more importantly, it's also telling you the type of data that can go into the database table. Right? So that way, if your ID field, you try to insert some characters in it, it's not going to work. Now, while Ruby as a language is very forgiving, if you want to change data types, just go ahead. It's just like JavaScript. You want to throw a letter in there, you want to throw a number in there, whatever, it'll just do it. But databases do not do that. So that's why that information is important. So I might be able to, on a Ruby level, take information and change data types. The moment I try to write it back to the database, we're going to get some issues. All right. So let's type in the next command, which is article.methods.size. What do you suppose that does? Well, it tells you how many methods there are associated with the ActiveRecord component inside of our model. So in the previous iterations of this book, apparently they had 549 methods, and apparently somebody took the time to write 59 more since the last release. So they come up with new stuff all the time. All right. Next little section here, we start to talk about more about the concepts of the abstraction. And what they're really trying to show you is how Ruby works with classes. And this is a very brief little overview. But notice as we move here, how we have a generic class for car. It doesn't have anything defined in it, but it is defined, even though it's empty. And then I can go ahead and instantiate, right, car.new, and store it. And then I can instantiate again and store it. So I have car1, car2. They're both different objects. They're both built on the same class. It's pretty simple little syntax. Not like the Java syntax that you've learned in the past, but conceptually I think you guys understand that we're instantiating a new version. Now the next thing that we'll start to look at is the fact that you can actually put in information here and try to query what class is an object based on. So if you know the variable name for the object that you've created, you can actually invoke the method called class, and it will tell you what class the object belongs to, because you might be working with code that somebody else created and you're not really seeing the whole grand scheme of things. Clearly, if you coded the class called car, you would know that, but if you hadn't and you needed to know which class it is, then you could type in this command and figure out what class it belongs to, so if you need to go change some stuff in the class file, you know which class file to look at. All right. So the interesting thing is that they have some terminology things here that are kind of important. Okay, so if you notice real carefully in this paragraph, and I'm going to actually add a highlight to that because I think that's a pretty important little piece of knowledge. Now, notice that we talked about comparisons to other object-oriented languages, and the one that I'll refer to most often is going to be Java, since I know that you guys have all learned that language. And notice that here we are going to be creating getters and setters, but notice how they refer to them in this language. They call them reader and writer methods, right? Reader would be the equivalent to a get, because you're usually with a get you're pulling the information back, right? Not usually, you are. And then with a writer method is where you actually set a value. So if you notice in the code below how we do this. With the class car, we are now adding some capabilities here, and I'm going to expand this a little bit just to make it a little easier to read. And notice how we are setting some values. And do you guys remember the conventions with the @signs? Maybe not. But the moment that you are taking a piece of information that's being sent to the class to add it to the object, in other words, when you are doing the set and the write, you use this approach, and notice that, and this is pretty important, and we talked about this last time, that this syntax right here, that there's no space between the equal sign and the objects on either side of it. That's just the convention of the language. So we're going to be sending in text. That text is then applied to the instantiated object. All right. So that @sign, if you guys don't remember what it means, go back to the previous chapter. But that's what the indication is that we are instantiating it as an object. And then the converse is that if we're pulling something back, then we are pulling it from that object. All right. So notice that the terminology here is pretty simplistic, and I think pretty easy to understand. I mean, these are very, very basic ways to do get and set. In some ways, I kind of wish they called it that instead. But the convention in this language is that we don't do the same thing we do in Java, where convention in Java is like get, we would probably say get make and set make, right? Here, you know the difference between the two because the set has an equal sign and something you're passing to it, where the get does not. Just really is as simple as that. All right. So once you have that stuff going, and then you go ahead and you instantiate it, the moment I instantiate that object, it gets stored, even though none of the things, none of the values, none of the attributes have been set. So that's why when we type the next command, myCar.make, the output of it is nil, because we never set it. If we go ahead and actually set it by just using a simple equal sign and a string, the next time we type that same command, myCar.make, it will spit back to us Toyota. You can then go ahead and change it, and then it'll come back Mazda, if that's what you decided to do. All right, as we proceed here, now we're going to start to talk about some of the basic type of operations that we're going to do when we're interfacing with databases through this abstraction layer. And they bring up this acronym CRUD, and I'm hoping that maybe you've heard this before, but it basically refers to the standard database operations. And what are those?
Crying rabbits undermine doctors.
Crying rabbits undermine doctors?
No.
That is incorrect, sir, but very funny. Aaron?
Yeah, I wrote that one last night.
I know one was destroyed.
Okay, you're on the right track. C is for create,
Yeah.
R is for retrieve,
Okay.
U is for update,
Oh.
and
okay,
D is
okay.
for delete or destroy. But typically create, retrieve, update, and destroy. So create a new record, retrieve the contents of a record, change a pre-existing one, or remove the record. And those are, the things that we kind of are accustomed to working with databases, that's the kind of content that we work with. So, all right. We've already worked with the fact that we know how to instantiate an object at this point. So we're going to use the new keyword, and we're actually going to type in this command. So if you want to type that all in manually, that's fine. If you want to copy paste it, that's fine too. I'm actually going to type it. It's not a bad exercise. So I'm just going to say article with lowercase equals article.new. So once again, when I press enter here, it should give me an output that looks like the book. Now notice what it did is it spit back what it did. It created a new article. And notice that all the stuff inside the article is listed as nil. Right? Now if you remember back to one of the previous examples, the ones where we didn't type them in, where we created the car make, and then we tried to retrieve what it was, and it just said nothing. You never said anything. That's what it's telling you. It's like, I created it, but it's empty. It's the equivalent of creating a variable that doesn't have any values. It just so happens that this refers to a variable that holds a whole database record. So this database record is basically blank at this point. So this is a fun little command. This is weird, actually. And I'll say article underscore new record question mark. Article.new underscore record question mark. True. And really what that's telling you is that what's currently being stored in article is a freshly instantiated object that contains nothing. So the answer is true. Is this new? Yes.
Memory assignment.
That's exactly correct. I mean, it really is the equivalent. Whenever you're instantiating an object, folks, you're taking that blueprint, which is in a file, you're connecting or not to the database, you're creating an object, and then it exists in memory. Now that it exists in memory under this variable name article, we can do things with it. So the next command that they'd like us to type is article.attributes. You got to spell it right. So sometimes the copy paste is actually your friend. And then, what did I do wrong? Oh yeah, see, you got to spell right. What did I spell? Art Kyle. You got to spell it correctly. All right. And now notice what it spits back at us, and notice the fact that it's all sitting inside curly brackets as well, using that one syntax we learned last week, the syntax of a hash, basically. The key value pairs, the named column, notice the column names have quotes around them, and then the value that's stored in each one of those for this particular object, which all are nil, right? We didn't add anything. And really, in essence, it's really doing the same thing that we saw up here. It's giving us the same information. It's just a different format. Same difference, though. So two different ways that you can pull back the same information. Now, you might question yourself as why is one to be used over the other? Well, it depends on what your goal is. But it's, in essence, showing you that you have a couple different means for extracting that information. And both are useful depending on the situation. All right, so now let's start going through and actually putting in values for the different column names. Now, one advantage of actually doing an output like this is I can see what all the column names are. So the first one, I'm actually going to say article.title equals, and let's just copy what they have here, Rails conf. We got single quotes around it. You can use double quotes, doesn't really matter much. I'm going to use single. Okay. The response from the prompt indicates that the string was received and stored. That's kind of giving you the thumbs up that it worked. The next thing is the body. Now this one's got enough information in here that I'm actually going to copy it. So I'm going to do a Control-C. Or actually, I'll do a right-click. That way you guys can see it. And if you're using Windows 10, you can come over to your prompt and actually hit a Control-V to paste. If you have older versions of Windows, you would want to right-click paste, and for whatever reason, it is not responding to it. Fascinating. But if you have a right-click that works, it should paste for you. The other approach, too, is you can always come up to this little icon and go to Edit and choose Paste. That's just a good FYI. So once you have that typed in, it's just a longer string for the body. And actually, if you remember up here that the body actually is text, so apparently that's a string that has more than the capability of the regular string data type. Now, remember, the data type that's being declared here is the data type for the database. Ruby doesn't care. Remember that? So we're doing this for the sake of the database, not for the sake of Ruby. Okay, so that is stored. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to do article dot published underscore at, and I would recommend that you use today's date. It shows you how old the book is, because he obviously did this on the 13th of April in 2013. And I'm using this format for the date just the same as he is. All right, let's move on. Next command that he would like us to type is just to type article. Now you should already anticipate before I press enter that article, being a variable that exists only in memory right now, holds the information that we just added. So the ID is still nil. The title is Rails conf. The body is that long whatever. And published at has a date. Okay, so the stuff that we typed in worked. The next thing that we're going to do is the equivalent, if you were working in a database product, of leaving that row or that record in the database and moving to a different row. The moment you leave that row, then it writes back to the disk or writes back to storage. So the moment I hit article.save, it goes ahead and begins an interaction with the database by virtue of the instantiated model. The model that was an object in memory is now written to the database. How do we verify that? Well, here's that where the tool comes in handy. So I'm going to hit the refresh button here in the SQLite browser, and voila. Notice that the database now contains the entry that I created. Interestingly, notice the ID. Now, do you guys notice from the prompt, there was no ID. But what happens is the database product itself automatically generates it with every new record. Notice also, real carefully, that when I type the article.save command, or the .save method is really what I'm triggering, it tells you it begins a transaction. And what is it doing here? Somebody translate this for me. What's going on here?
It's putting the information into the database.
Right.
Because it's saying insert into articles, and then it goes to the title, body.
Right. It's just putting it into SQL, right?
Yeah.
Isn't this a whole lot better than having to write all that?
It is.
It is.
Because
And that
I took databases. That was really time-consuming.
it is time consuming. I mean, I'll tell you what though, a very helpful piece of advice, if you guys learn SQL, it's probably one of the most important IT skills you can learn. I have let's say a cousin-in-law, I guess I would call him, right? So one of my 31 first cousins is married to a guy who's a database guy, and he's like, the best thing I ever did was learn databases. Never go hungry if you know databases. There's always work. You know SQL, you'll always have a job. So, actually it really is. SQL is a really cool language, if you want to call it that. But I love the fact that this language, through all the abstraction that it does, and the object relational mapping, these are the tools that we're using, takes the simple things that we did, and with one command, converts all of it into a SQL statement and commits it to the database.
Going along with what Tom was saying before.
This is a good stopping point right here. We've accomplished some pretty important tasks. We're going to take a 5-minute break here in class and come back with a fresh video.